Oh, hi there. Ollie Anderson here. You're listening to Creative Status. If this is the first time that you found the podcast, then welcome. This is a place where we talk about being real. That means moving towards the natural drive that we all have towards wholeness and connection to ourselves and other people and life itself, but also connecting to our nature and really just kind of unblocking ourselves using the creative process as a vehicle for doing that. If you're returning to the podcast, welcome. Hope life is good. Today's interview is with Kareen Erbe. Kareen is a garden design consultant and an educator. She's an expert in permaculture and how we can build sustainable systems basically in our gardens that are more connected to nature and the way that things just work. On a deeper level though, we take this conversation to some of the depths, let's say, of human psychology, looking at what we can learn about the human experience by really deeply connecting to our gardens. This conversation really kind of woke me up to a lot of things. Like just being in your garden may not seem like a big deal, but actually if you really think about it, you've created your own ecosystem. And if you approach that in a real way, you can just learn so many things about life and the human condition and how things work, the attitude that we can cultivate if we want to be part of that, and how we can keep flowing ultimately. So that's the kind of thing you can expect in this interview. Kareen, thank you so much. I found this really edifying and enlightening. So thank you for your energy and your expertise and all that kind of stuff. Everyone else, hope this helps. Here we go. Thanks a bunch. Boom. Oh, hi there, Kareen. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Creative Status. You're basically an expert in one of my favorite things in life, which is food. I try to eat a lot of whole foods, but you've taken it way deeper, and I feel like there's a lot of important learning that you can share with the world around the things that you've learned. So before we get into it, do you feel like introducing yourself, telling people what you do, what you're all about, and what you want to get out of this conversation that we're about to have?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Ollie, for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate it. So my name is Kareen Erbe, and I have a business in Bozeman, Montana, in the United States called Broken Ground. And I teach people in cold climates how to grow their own food. And I do this through consultations, through design services, and through a signature program called the Resilient Homestead Program, where I take people through the site planning process. But I'm all about growing food, encouraging other people to do the same, and in addition to that, kind of bolstering local food systems. And today, I just love chatting also on a philosophical level about, why it's important to grow your own food, how to reconnect to the natural world, how to do something meaningful, and all of the benefits that something like gardening can bring to your life.
Wow. So we'll get into all that, obviously. Before we do, what exactly is permaculture? Because I think a lot of the work that you do is around permaculture. Like I've got a basic understanding, but I suppose how is it different, let's say, to the more standardized way of food production that most people kind of associate food production as being produced by? That was a very weird sentence, but ultimately, how is permaculture more real than what most of us may be used to, and what kind of problems is it solving for the world?
Sure, yeah. So one of the main things that I do teach, and thanks for saying that, highlighting that, Ollie, is permaculture. And permaculture it stands for permanent agriculture or permanent culture. And it's a design framework, design approach for sustainable living and land use that's rooted in the observation of natural systems. So how can I mimic natural systems in the way that I design my yard and the way that I design my garden and in the way I design my life and my community? So it's way beyond just gardening, right? It's a life design set of tools that you use. And, part of it has to do with gardening. How can I reduce my ecological footprint and live lighter on the earth? But at the same time, it's also about, how can I engage in food production in the most, in the way that natural systems do.
Wow. So now you've cracked this conversation wide open. One of the things that I'm really, really interested in for practical and philosophical reasons is how human beings can be more real. I think in a practical sense, if we're more real, which means that we're aligned with natural systems and we're aligned with the drives that we all have towards wholeness and connection and all this kind of stuff, if we can align ourselves with that, then we feel better, we flow more, we have less emotional baggage and things like that because it kind of dissolves as we kind of put ourselves into that way of being. But also philosophically, just understanding ourselves as creatures that are connected to all of nature, all of the systems, and that work in the same way, because we're not separate from those systems, we're part of those systems, it basically improves our lives to like a massive, massive degree. And I think the reason that food is such an important part of that is because there's so many things in the world that have become completely disconnected from these systems, but these natural systems. But food, even if it is filtered through like, social conditioning and all of the things that cause us to become disconnected, food is always inherently connected to those systems at some level. And so food is a really great avenue to get back in alignment with where we're supposed to be. And that's how I see it. So hopefully I'm not overly romanticizing what you do and like how understanding food can help us to be more real. But I think it's really important. So in my own life, I just try and eat whole foods all the time. Like I break everything down into wholeness, which means it's connected to nature basically and connected to life, or to fragmentation, which means there's some conceptual idea that takes us away from it. When I think about food, the same principles apply. So like all of the processed bullshit foods that most people eat in modern society, they're just fragmented ultimately in the sense of being disconnected from nature itself. And they go through so many different steps before they actually end up on your plate. Whole foods, there's less steps involved basically, and there's less ingredients. You look at a potato, you know it's a potato, for example. And so making those choices has really improved my life. But what you're talking about is way deeper, like way, way deeper. It's putting ourselves even more inherently within those systems in a conscious way so that we can become more human. So I apologize because I've just ranted at you like nonstop for like, it feels like 20 minutes, but we've only been recording for 5. So sorry about that. But what do you have to say about all that basically? Like, am I getting too excited, or is the kind of thing you're talking about really helping people to return to who they are basically?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think, and I think the act of something like being in the garden takes it to another level. Like you say, it's one to eat whole foods. And I think that's super important, right? Food as medicine, and people need to live by that more than they do, right? That's why we have, especially in, say, the United States, for example, such a kind of sick society is partly to do with our corporate food system and the amount of processed food and chemicals and herbicides and pesticides that are used in making so-called food. And so that's why getting back to local food and or growing the food yourself is on a nutritional level so much better. But also there are all the intangible benefits that you get from being in a garden, from planting a tomato plant, from putting seeds in the soil, right? Those are all immeasurable, right? From having, soil on your hands, from smelling that or seeing pollinators in your garden. And I think that's what we can't measure, and yet that's what makes us human, right? We weren't meant to be, on these digital devices 24/7. That's not where we feel the most connected. And a garden is a place where you feel it's participatory. So it's beautiful and wonderful to go on a hike out in the natural world. But with gardening and growing your own food, you participate in the process. You put a seed in the soil, you prune a tree, right? You dig a hole to put in a tomato plant. You water those plants and you care for them and you tend them and you cultivate them. And the garden has a lot to teach you, about who you are as a human being. So I think getting back to those very basics is what I think people crave, even if they don't know it.
Yeah. 100% agree. Like, I think if you look at modern society, so many people are kind of I always end up throwing the same quote out in these podcasts. They're living lives of quiet desperation, is a quote by Thoreau. And the reason that they're living those lives of quiet desperation is they've become disconnected from themselves, disconnected from other people, and disconnected from life itself and the kind of natural cycles and processes that you're talking about. And that just leads to this kind of void that people constantly try and fill with things that are never going to fill it. So, consumerism and crappy food, to keep the example going that we were using earlier, relationships that, are transactional instead of truly relational, and all these different things. They're just running around on the hamster wheel of modern life, trying to give themselves something that they can never give themselves within that context. And a lot of people, they do things on the weekend that may lead them in the right direction. So I go hiking most weekends.
Great.
And I never thought of it in the way that you just said, but it's so true. Like when I go hiking, I'll have these little moments here and there where I realize how sublime nature is, and I can kind of just surrender to being part of this huge system. But it's true, like I'm not really participating in it. I'm just kind of walking around like a passive observer. And gardening sounds like the next level. Like personally, I do a tiny bit of gardening, but nothing really of any significance. My parents have a greenhouse, and sometimes I go around to the greenhouse and I have a look at what's going on. I don't know if that counts, but like I'll see things growing and I'll be like amazed by it. Or I have a cheese plant in my living room, and every so often this cheese plant will sprout a new leaf, and I'll have like a big epiphany about how life is just, it's constantly working without anybody doing anything. Like this leaf was just doing its thing, and now all of a sudden, like, I'll watch it like unfurl and just get bigger and bigger, and like that'll give me like a little moment where I'm like, wow, life is just so amazing. But that's it. Like I'm not really participating in the way I could. That's why I'm learning, like talking to you, like already. So
yeah. Well, and I think what having a garden does, and I mean it happens on a hike too, but I think in a garden especially, is that there's always abundance, right? And there's a joke, right, that you should lock your car doors during harvest season or zucchini season, because somebody's going to throw a bunch of zucchinis in the back of your car or on your doorstep or something like that. And I think when you have a garden, you realize how much abundance there is and how we've been sold because of capitalism, right? We've been sold this model of scarcity, that there's never enough for people. And so they are on this hamster wheel of getting more and wanting more, or being sold that they need more. Whereas when you have a garden, right, you realize there's always abundance. That one tomato produces, can produce dozens and dozens of tomatoes for you, or that calendula that's in the garden, which is like an edible flower, it seeds and self-seeds, and you have more calendula every year, and you almost have too much, and you start giving it away, and your mint starts to grow, and you have to divide it because otherwise it'll take over a part of your garden. And so then you can gift, mint, or you can gift lemon balm, or you can gift these plants that keep on overproducing. You can gift them to other people, and then you can create. I always like to say the garden is the great connector, right? You connect with other people that way. Or I have herbalist friends that come and harvest the elderberries in my garden, and then they gift me back elderberry syrup, and I get to support their livelihood, and I get to visit with them. So like you said, the garden is relational too. And one of the other definitions of permaculture is the art of creating beneficial relationships. And so whether that's beneficial relationships between plants and the plants that you choose to grow in a specific area, or if that's beneficial relationships between plants and people, or plants, animals, and people, or beneficial relationships between people, right? All of those things are important for us to become whole people. And we're missing some of that now in this kind of age of disconnection from the natural world, disconnection from our food, disconnection from one another, right? We're missing those beneficial relationships that keep us sane, that make us less anxious, that make us less depressed, that, all of those things that we're kind of looking at, because, the world is looking pretty grim out there, right? And it's easy to numb out. And so, remembering that community and relationship, again, teachings from the garden kind of can apply to our life, and to constantly seek those out.
Yeah. It sounds almost like the garden has reminded you what it is to be a real human being. And the reason I say that is I think there are two different versions of almost every human on the planet. There's the version that exists in the world. So the world being, all of the social systems that we've created to try and manipulate nature and to deal with our collective fears about life and the economy and all this stuff that seems so important. But ultimately, that's just a bunch of ideas. It's a bunch of concepts and human interpretations. It's not life or reality itself. We can change the world, basically, if we so desire. Not by snapping our fingers or anything like that, but like the world, it's not fixed. Reality itself is all of these things that you're talking about. So it's connection, it's abundance, it's the systems of or laws, let's say, of cause and effect. You plant the seed, well, the effect is going to be that eventually you're going to get a tomato, basically, right? And so most people, they crave living in that real world. That's ultimately when we were talking about the existential void and all that kind of stuff. The reason they feel that void is because they're not in reality. If we are in reality, we have less depression because we're moving with those natural cycles. We have a sense of connection and a sense of purpose and all that kind of thing. We have less anxiety because we're not putting out a false image into the world, which is constantly getting feedback from reality that is not real. And so we're getting this kind of negative buzz of reality all the time. And so ultimately, many of the problems that people have are because they've taken an identity from the world and not from reality itself. And if I understand what you're saying properly, and obviously I'm putting my own skew on it because I'm just biased with my own philosophy about things, but you're ultimately kind of saying that the garden can remind us who we really are. Like, I don't know, am I making that too simple? But it's almost like it's saying, right, this is who you really are. This is what life really is and what it can be. And all you need to do is participate in these natural cycles instead of taking yourself out of them.
Yeah, we've forgotten, right, that we are part of nature. That, people often refer to like nature as over there. And I think what the garden reminds us of is that we are, a participant in natural systems, that the patterns that we see in ourselves are also mimicked in, what we see in the natural world, and that we are, and that the plants and the animals are our relatives, right? Like an indigenous, traditional ecological knowledge, right? They view all of those plants, animals, inanimate, even rocks, right? All of that are those are relatives, and people don't have that view. The Western view of the world is not that way, right? Not that we're connected with all of these living beings that help us, that are part of our ecosystem, that help us live in the world. But we have kind of taken this approach of like, having dominion over things, and that these things are here so that we can treat them as, quote, resources, rather than seeing ourselves as part of this much bigger ecosystem and world. We're just a very small part of it. And of course, we're in the age, of the Anthropocene, right? And we've had a huge impact on the natural world, but we've had that impact and allowed ourselves to have that impact because of this mindset that somehow we're separate from it, and somehow we're maybe, superior to it, rather than understanding that we are a participant in it. And I think that's what the garden reminds you of, is that you are participating, and humans can have a regenerative footprint on the planet. They can help in the restoration of the natural world. And then, of course, they can be super destructive. And we can decide who we are, right? a few years ago, I eliminated our whole front yard. I took all the grass out of our front yard and I put in a bunch of native pollinator plants, right? And now there are a ton of different pollinators that come to what used to be like a monoculture lawn. I created this pollinator paradise. And so we need to remind people too that they have some agency and that they can make a difference. And that's also why people feel isolated and alienated, is because they don't feel like they can have an impact in a world where things are not looking really awesome, right? So, but when you start in the garden and you are like, I planted that, and now look at all the bees and other pollinators that are coming to it, that makes it feel kind of good, right? That you can make that small difference. And I think that's another thing that the garden, it gives you some kind of agency to be like, oh, like my participation in this makes a difference. It means that I get tomatoes on my plate or a salad on my plate or, potatoes or whatever. But it also, the fact that you can, like you saw your plant, the leaf unfurl, the fact that you can watch a plant grow, right? That's pretty amazing, right? Like, oh, it was super tiny and now it's much bigger and now it has fruit and now I get to pick it, right? Like that gives you some agency that you can have some kind of impact.
So it's empowering ultimately because it reminds you how life works, but then there's this kind of distinction I keep bringing in about the world versus reality and the human-centric view that you were alluding to, like we've got dominion over the earth and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't work. Like that view of life actually has created the system that we now have, which is destroying the planet in many respects, but also it's destroying our relationships with ourselves. And the reason it's doing that is very simple, actually, when I listen to how you just broke it down. Like there's two different paths. There's one path where we act like we're independent from nature. We act like we're separate from nature, that we're not we're not a species that can participate in it and all these kind of things. That path leads to destruction ultimately, like at the level of the individual, but also collectively as a species. The other path is basically the path of interdependence, where we realize, okay, the choices that we make to either participate or not participate in these natural systems that are always going to be there and that actually serve us anyway, making those choices is actually going to be good for our mental health. It's going to be good for the planet. It's going to show us that we are connected and all these different things that you've kind of alluded to. And it's basically about choice ultimately, right? Like we choose one path or the other. One is more aligned with our nature. And if we go down that road, we'll probably feel a lot better. So what are some more of the lessons that you've learned by going down that path in a conscious way and participating in these cycles in the way that you have done? So one lesson that you've already mentioned was the abundance thing. I think that's really important. The other lesson was that we can participate and we can make a difference. I suppose if it's not putting you on the spot, like what are the top 5 lessons or something like that the gardens taught you?
Yeah. I mean, I think another lesson that I've learned is that, and this is where you can apply ecological principles to your life, right? Just like a tomato every year needs some compost, needs additional fertility in order to give fruit. You also need the same thing, right? So you can't expect year after year, if you planted tomatoes in the same place without adding fertility to the soil, without taking care of the soil, you wouldn't expect that tomato to give as much or to yield as much every year. But we as human beings, we don't give ourselves that fertility, which would translate to celebrating our successes, recognizing the things that we have done that year and writing them down, right? We're very quick to be like, oh, I didn't accomplish this, or this, right? But we don't really say, look at everything that I've done or how far I've come. That's our fertility, right? That keeps us going. And so looking at a garden where you're like, oh yeah, I totally wouldn't have that expectation of that tomato plant, right? Because it wasn't cared for. But we have that expectation of ourselves, I think, a lot of the time. of just keep going, just be more productive, just, without any kind of replenishment, right? And so that's one of the biggest things that I've learned, one of the lessons. I'd say another lesson, one of the permaculture principles. Permaculture is guided by a set of ethics and principles, and one of the principles is produce no waste, right? In a natural system, there is a life cycle of living and dying and decay that, again, goes back to the fertility piece and understanding that there is no waste in a natural system. So having looking at your life and being like, where am I wasting my time? Where am I producing waste in my system? Because waste that doesn't have, that's not used in some way becomes a liability. So that a factory farm, for example, where you aren't cycling all of that manure and it just kind of piles up in these big vats of manure, right, in a factory farm, which is horrible, right, is a big liability. Whereas if you had a permaculture farm, you'd have those animals on pasture. And so their poop would be contributing to soil fertility, which would be growing their food. And so the same can be said of like, if we're harboring, bad emotions, right? Or harboring negativity against someone or jealousy or whatever, and it's stagnant and stuck and has nowhere to go, right? That becomes a real problem in our system. I think another lesson is just like that failure is inevitable, right? Like if you're not failing in your garden every year, you aren't trying hard enough. That's a real like we don't like being beginners as adults oftentimes, but that failure is learning. Failure is feedback in the garden, right? Oh, my squash didn't do very well this year. Well, why is that? Could have been the soil, could have been the sun, could have been, that I didn't water it enough, or maybe it's the variety that I chose, right? Failure is feedback, just like in life. And I think, the garden teaches you humility, that you are just, again, part of this whole system, that some things are out of your control, right? That you can do what you can, but then you have to let go and accept the way the natural system works, that you are at the whim of whether it decides to frost late, after you've put in your garden, or you have an early frost at the end of the season and you lose part of your crop. There is an element of doing all you can, but then also letting go, right? And that's also a lesson. How do you get? There have been years where I can't do that gracefully, right? You put in all of this time and energy, and suddenly, you lose a crop to an early frost or whatever. But it teaches that that humility, but also kind of teaches you grace. How can you be okay with that? And I think one of the things that when you engage in gardening, right, it really does force you to pay attention to the climate, to the soil, to sun and shade patterns, to nighttime temperatures, and is it getting too low for your plants? Do you need to cover stuff? All of that, again, makes it more participatory. At this time of year, I'm always looking at what the nighttime temperatures are doing, right? And in the fall, you're looking at the nighttime temperatures. So oftentimes, our farmers and gardeners are managing so many different factors, right? I think we need to definitely change the narrative around our farmers and growers, right? There's this, he or she is just a farmer, right? And it's like, actually, they're the CEO of a fairly complex process that they're managing. And so I think those are, off the top of my head, some of the biggest lessons for me that stand out in a garden.
Yeah. Like everything you just shared it's amazing, because ultimately what you shared is that the garden itself is a microcosm for the bigger picture of life itself. And so the only way that you can really get results from the garden is by truly kind of getting out of that identity of the world we were talking about and putting yourself into presence and into nature and letting it kind of shape you and kind of mold you into in this more humble version of yourself, which really is just the true version of who you are, I think. Like you getting to that point of humility, it's a journey of acceptance. And it means you've accepted life and you've accepted these cycles, and you're not just reacting to things because that's going to take you out of the flow. You're literally just, by the sound of it, responding from one day to the next, or even one moment to the next, to, the things that are kind of happening and emerging and flowing in the garden, but also the weather, like you were saying, and everything else. You just get into this point of pure presence almost. And the only way that you're going to get the results from the garden is by doing that. And it reminds me of, there's a quote by Jesus. He says, a corrupt tree brings forth bad fruit. And that applies to the garden, obviously, but it also applies to life. And that's kind of what you're talking about. It sounds like to me that all of these lessons that you've learned, which have basically taken you into a deeper sense of awareness and acceptance, so you can take better action in the garden, that stuff basically has had ramifications that have improved your life as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think one of the things when you have a garden too, or I have a food forest of fruit trees and berry bushes, right? That provides, 6 months of fresh fruit a year for us, and, a lot of frozen and dehydrated fruit for the rest of the year. That is such an example of a dynamic ecosystem, right? Just like your garden, any garden is a dynamic ecosystem. Things are growing, things are changing, things are dying, right? And that, again, is a lesson for us that we are dynamic beings, right? That we are growing and changing, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in bad ways, right? But having to choose, what, again, that quote of like, what you feed grows, right? And making those decisions in the garden of, that mint is getting a little bit out of control. I need to, take some and divide it and give it to my friend. I really like how this thing is growing over here, but let me prune it back a little bit so that it grows better. All of those things make you also question too, right? Like, what is my ecosystem? What supports me? There's the non-human species that support me, but what are the things in my life that support the ecosystem of me? Say I'm a tree, like, what's my shrub species? What's building my soil? What's attracting pollinators to so you start to build who is it in my life that serves that role? Or what is it in my life? Like your hikes are part of your ecosystem of maintaining yourself, right? Maybe coffee with friends, maybe, a chat on the phone, maybe this podcast, right? That's part of your ecosystem of becoming a whole human being. And I think when you start to participate in any kind of agriculture or growing of plants and, species, you start to understand, all of these different plants rely on different things. They have, there's the microbes in the soil. There's the fungi in the soil. There's the sun. There's the water. There's my participation, right? Like all of that stuff is you need in order for that plant to grow to its full potential. And so why would we think that we can just in isolation, doing one thing in our lives, think that we're actually whole people? That's why, it's like we expect, I like to use this example too of, we always talk about like it takes a village to raise a child. The same thing is it takes an ecosystem to raise a child, right? We can't, so if you have a single mom or you just have two parents trying to raise a child, that child won't be whole. That's why a village, you need the aunts and the uncles and the cousins and the elders, right? You need all of those people serve a different role in that child's life. So a lot of us end up in therapy, right? Because we didn't have a village, because we didn't have a whole system. And it's not the fault of the parents or it's just that we have lost the village and the community culture, right? Our society is no longer built that way or designed that way. So permaculture is all about life design, like designing systems for human and ecosystem health. Right?
Real way.
Right. In a very real, like, how do you get to the like most meaningful, real part of being a human being? Part of that is being in relationship with other human beings. Part of that is being in relationship with non-human species that are also supporting you and that you support yourself.
Yeah. It's so powerful, and it comes down to the humility thing again, but also it introduces, I guess, gratitude. Like, all of the things that are just constantly nourishing us, it's incredible. And a lot of the time, we don't even need to do anything to just receive them. It's like what you were saying about abundance. Like, the sun, 93 million miles away, wherever it is, it's just there, giving us vitamin D and light and all the things that we need to nourish the earth and blah, blah, blah. Air, water, all these different things. It's crazy how much is just given to us to keep us going. And obviously that's because we evolved on the planet that has all these things, but it's just crazy. Like, when you think about it in the terms that you're kind of sharing. The other thing is, like what you just said, it shows the futility of this idea that seems to dominate our culture, that we can be totally in control of our lives, that we can set goals and we can just totally force life to meet our will. It's so neurotic and it causes so much misery. Like, ultimately, that is a lack of humility. It's a lack of gratitude, because it's people acting like they're the ones doing all the work, which is simply not true. And it's actually causing problems for them, because it's taking them out of these natural cycles that are constantly helping them to be nourished and to move forward in a real way, in a humble way, if they just accept what's there. And so is there something there, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, that reminds me actually of, in permaculture, one of the biggest, the top principle, or one of the top principles, is observe and interact. And, that's all about, if you're going to design a site and you're going to put in a garden or a food forest or whatever, the first thing that you need to do before you do anything is observe, right? Observe your space, and where does the water collect, and what are the patterns that come onto, where does the snow melt first? Where are the leaves? All of that kind of stuff. What existing plants do you have? But a lot of it also is about harmonizing with existing patterns. So one of the whole tenets of permaculture design is like, harmonize with the pattern that's there rather than fight against it. So an example would be looking at your site and being like, oh, there's like a lot of water that collects in this area. How am I going to like get that water away from that area? Rather than saying, oh, there's a lot of water that collects there. Why don't I put moisture-loving plants in that place, right? Like, you're harmonizing with the existing pattern rather than fighting against it, which is what we do when we try to control, right? When we try to control our lives. And what it is in a garden, right? You understand certain ecological principles and you participate with them. Right? So you harmonize with them. And so that's also what we want to do in our lives, right? Is not kind of fight against, this is oftentimes what leads to a lot of sadness and anxiety, right? Is like fighting against what is rather than accepting what is and seeing how we can harmonize with it. And I know there are like difficult things that people that happen in people's lives. And I'm not saying that that's not something that's important to recognize and honor, but we also have to a lot of our suffering, right, comes from wanting to control it or wanting to it not to be how it is, right? And so in the natural world, it's the same. It's like the more you try to control something, sometimes the harder it gets, rather than saying, okay, as an example, when you have a pest in your garden, one of the things that happens in conventional agriculture is you use a pesticide, right, to deal with that pest. So you go to war with that particular pest. So you buy some chemical from the store and you spray it on your plant or whatever. Whereas in a kind of permaculture way of thinking would be, if we have a pest in our system, something is out of balance, right? So we're actually going to add life. That what we need to do is likely there might be something out of balance in the soil. So we're going to add more soil, more microorganisms to the soil in order to add life. So we're going to take a step towards the natural world rather than try to go away from it in terms of just going to war with it. And so that's the same thing. Like, we want to take a step towards life. When life gives us some kind of challenge, we want to step into it and see, what the analogy would be, in terms of adding soil microorganisms, or, you want to enhance the ecosystem in some way. You want to add life to the ecosystem so that it can do its work. Right? The soil microorganisms will do their work and will feed your plant if you understand the science behind it and a little bit of the mystery, right? And you don't interfere as much in it.
Yeah. That's the lesson, I think. Ultimately what we're talking about is acceptance, I think. Acceptance of life on life's terms, not on the terms that we wish it had because of our, resistance to it, because of our own fears and emotional stuff and all that kind of thing. And if we can accept life and work with it, that's when we get into this kind of harmonization state that you're talking about, where we're flowing with life ultimately, right? It's all about forcing life or flowing. And the key insight I've taken from this conversation, I think, is that the way to get into that harmonization is that you have to participate. It's not just a passive thing. If you just don't do anything ever, then you basically lose the flow, because life keeps flowing, but you lose touch with it because you were just so open-minded that your brain fell out. If you go too far the other way and you're one of these people that's just doing for the sake of feeling like you're doing things, that takes you out of the flow as well. And so participation is knowing. It's kind of like the Taoist thing with the Wu Wei, effortless action. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept, but basically doing what is your responsibility and duty to do, but then letting nature do the rest, and then you can flow with it. And it all comes down to acceptance, because if you don't accept it, then you can't get in that flow. And that brings me to one final question I'll go through, I guess. So we keep talking about how the garden teaches us a lot about life, but has it taught you anything about death? Because I think that's a big question to throw in at the end. Sorry, because we could open a whole can of worms. But ultimately, part of these natural cycles, and realizing that we're like the tomato on the tree or on the tomato plant or whatever, is that we're going to go through phases, aren't we? So we're going to go through a growing stage, and then we're going to kind of ripen, but then eventually we are just kind of going to decay. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the process. We're going to go back to the hole, so to speak. I'm just wondering if you've learned anything about that could maybe help us sum all this up, if that's even possible.
Yeah. I think the garden teaches you that death is inevitable, but that it's part of the life cycle, right? And that it contributes fertility for the next growing season. And so I think that's, again, we are, just like we're disconnected from our food, there's a certain disconnection that we have as a society in terms of aging, in terms of death and dying, right? That we don't fully embrace it because it's scary, understandably. But again, if you immerse yourself in the natural world, you realize that that is happening all of the time, right? That it's an inevitable part of life, right? And that if things didn't die and decay, right, there would be like too much abundance, right? There'd be too much growing, right? You can't have like leaves growing on a tree that then don't fall to the ground and create, fertility for the tree for the next year, right? There is a limit, right? And that's one of the things that's an issue at work right now, is we think that we can have unlimited growth in this world, and that's just not how natural systems work, right? There's always a limit to growth, and there's always death and decay that happens, and that's part of life. And I'm not saying that it's easy to accept, but when you're in a garden, it's easier to accept because you're like, yeah, that's what happens. And then there's a dormancy too, right? For us in the UK too, you have a dormant period in terms of winter. Thank goodness, as a gardener, I'm like, thank goodness I get some time off, right? And the plants themselves get to rest, right? And the soil gets to rest. And the more we can connect to the natural patterns, again, the more we can connect to the seasons, the better off we are, right? To recognize that, the reason that you don't feel like doing a heck of a lot and you just want to read and sip tea in the wintertime is completely natural.
Yeah.
Or the reason you might be feeling a little down is completely natural. And the reason you're in action in the spring and feel enthusiastic in the spring is totally natural, because the light is coming back and things are coming up, and like that's completely part of the cycle of the seasons and of your life, and you're connected to that. So of course it would have an impact on you, and we don't give that enough. We don't get that enough weight in our lives.
I think understanding all these things is what frees us from that existential void that we were talking about. It's amazing. Like this has been really a powerful one for me. Just thinking about how much we can learn just from nature, like everywhere. Like I said, like I often think I've kind of tapped into that when I go hiking and stuff, but it's so much deeper. And it's this the participation that lets you harmonize with it. I think that's just so vital for all of us. So that was amazing. Thank you so much. Can you let people know where they can find you, and like what your website is and anything else that you want to let people know?
Sure. Yeah. So people can find me at brokengroundpermaculture.com. That's my website. I'm also on Instagram at brokengroundmt, MT, which stands for Montana. At brokengroundmt. Those are the two places that it's easiest to find me. Yeah, definitely check out my programs. I do have my Resilient Homestead program is an online program where we meet on Zoom from November through February during the winter months. We do the learning and the planning and the dreaming so that in the spring we're ready to go in our gardens. So that program, I offer that every fall, and that's online and has some one-on-one time with me. But yeah, really enjoyed our conversation. I love taking kind of the garden's lessons into this kind of more philosophical way of looking at life, because I think it's needed, right? And would make us so much healthier as human beings.
That was amazing. Kareen, thank you so much for that. I'll share all your links and everything in the show notes. But I'm going to go stare at my cheese plant in awe now. So thank you for that. And yeah.
Thank you, Ollie. Thanks for having me on your podcast. Really appreciate it.